Hello and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. Today I am excited to share an interview that I had with David Moreno based out of Berkeley, California. David has been teaching yoga for over 3 decades and has so much to share about the evolution of yoga and how the climate has changed over all of these years. I think this is a really fun conversation and I'm excited to bring it to the table. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast, a place to explore possibility through mindfulness, movement, and self-discovery. Our intention is to deliver insight and inspiration while fostering conversations that are genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. We hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hello, good morning, David. I'm so excited to be talking to you today on the Connected Community Podcast.
Hi.
So I was looking that you've been teaching for 30 years. Is that correct?
Thousands of years.
Thousands of 30,000 years.
Prehistorically. Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I would love to talk to you about the evolution of yoga and how it's changed over the years. I've been teaching for 20 years. You've been teaching for 30, and we've definitely seen a lot of changes in the industry.
Still.
But let's start with how did your yoga journey begin and what initially drew you to the yoga practice?
I had danced professionally. I was dancing professionally in Southern California and Los Angeles and traveling with different shows and stuff. And I got to a certain point where I realized that, most dancers end up teaching yoga, teaching dance. Like that's like if you're not in a show or you're not traveling with a troupe, that you're basically teaching. And I felt like I don't really want to spend the rest of my life teaching dance, which is so ironic because I spent the rest of my life teaching yoga instead. But there's a reason for that. And in fact, one of my dancer colleagues started offering some yoga in her studio, and so I started taking that. That was kind of my first introduction. So I went from dance into yoga that way. And at that time, which was like late 70s, you were just a kid, baby. There were like in the city of Los Angeles, there were maybe like 3 yoga studios that you would have to drive an hour to, and they were only on certain days, and all that stuff. So it was a very different thing. So I dabbled because it wasn't really available. And then I moved to New Mexico and dabbled there. There was at least an Iyengar teacher that I got connected with, and then eventually an Ashtanga teacher. But it was always, at first it was in between things, because back then, even in the early 80s, yoga was like mostly geared for housewives, people that could take a class during the day. And so it wasn't until like Iyengar and Ashtanga really took hold in the community where there was something that was actually challenging, because I'd come from a dance background, right? So it was like, okay, well, that was sweet, but are we gonna move? And that was kind of my experience doing Iyengar yoga at first, because you spent most of your time moving props around the room, like fold your blanket, now go get a chair, now go get a straps. I always felt like I was in a ballet class and we were at the bar, but we were never actually dancing across the room, So I always felt like I was warming up, but there was never a payoff in any particular way. And then Ashtanga hit, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is challenging. It's a flow. There's a movement to it. It was really caught my attention and scared the hell out of me also, because it was just like terrifying, and to get up at 5:30 in the morning and go do your hour plus, practice every day. It was totally crazy. So I kind of started that way. And then I studied with T.S. Little in Santa Fe, New Mexico, for 5 years straight before he decided he and his partner then were going to India to study with Pattabhi Jois for people used to go to India for like a month at a time, because if you were over there wasn't the internet, and you just, you had to go, and if you wrote anybody, they didn't get them till 3 months after you'd return. So he went off and he said, here are the keys. you can teach the Tuesday and Saturday class. And it was like, I was ready to. I mean, because I had taught some dance, and it was like, oh yeah, I feel like I felt confident that I could at least carry some of that off. And so that's how I started teaching.
What was his style, T.S. Little,
Hmm.
when back then?
Oh, this is so fascinating because I feel like I was at the moment when, you know, people, if you do Ashtanga, you have to do authentic full series. You don't do any variations. If you do variations, it's no longer Ashtanga according to that tradition,
And
And so,
just to stop you really quick, David, because some people don't even know what Ashtanga is.
sorry.
Yeah. So explain that a little bit. I was trained in
Okay.
Ashtanga too.
Okay. So Ashtanga yoga basically has like six different series that are all life-threatening. And you learn one series at a time, and these may take you lifetimes, and some people never get past first series, and some people never get past second series, and and a few of them, like the senior teachers that I was studying with, had mostly were doing like fourth and fifth, some of sixth, so like they just got more complicated and more challenging and more, and yet there was always it was a formula. Like you always did the same poses in that series. There was no variations. And when I studied with Patabi Joyce, who was the originator of this system, mostly I studied with him in the United States. Like I didn't go to India. I waited till he came here, and he would only let you go as far as you could go through a series. And when you couldn't do that pose, he would dismiss you, and you would go and do the finishing poses, which were your inversions and your cooling down poses, inversions, headstand, shoulder stand, and you would do that. Even if you could do the other 10 poses on the other side of that one, he would have you stop. And it's so brilliant because it's so like what we don't do today, right? You only go as far as you can go, and you work on that until you can do, the whole thing. And like I said, not every people are happy just doing one series because it's so challenging and it's so beautiful. It's so challenging, but it's so rhythmic, and it has this whole process that you go. It's like a journey with yourself that you go through every day. So when T.S. came to town, he had studied some Iyengar. He learned with his mother. Like several senior teachers that I know learned yoga in the kitchen with their mother. Like that's how they learn. I know John Friend did. T.S. did. So I was there when he came into town, and he started teaching primary series. And we'd get up early in the morning, go to this little tiny studio, and because it was so challenging, he was like concerned that like a lot of people weren't coming to it. Santa Fe is like a retirement town in a way. It always has been an artistic town. People don't get up early, back then. And so he was really concerned that I don't know if I can make this here because it's not working. And I wanted him to stay because he was a brilliant teacher, clearly a brilliant teacher and a wonderful practitioner. And so I actually saw him have to try to teach Ashtanga to the general public. That doesn't work because most people can't do lotus. Most people can't do this. Most people can't do that, especially people coming in who are in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It's like, no, I don't know if we're going to do that, So what he did was he started breaking it down. And that's how Vinyasa yoga or flow yoga started. It was like, okay, it's no longer Ashtanga because we can't call it Ashtanga because we're not doing the prescribed series.
Right.
So I actually saw him be really creative and start okay, well, let's do this. And then he also had some Iyengar background, which he studied much deeper later on, as most people that do Ashtanga first do later on. And for those of you that don't know what Iyengar is, it's more, again, it's more prop oriented, and it's not a flow sequence. You're not doing pranayama with it or breathing practices with the asana practice or the poses.
It's very static. It's very static, and Ashtanga is very flow movement.
Right. I always felt like Ashtanga was jazz, and Iyengar was ballet at the bar, without going across the room. So that's how they distinguish themselves. And they're both they both studied with the same teacher, and as was taught back then, for whom and for when. Iyengar was taught one thing because that suited his needs. He had some physical challenges, and Batavi Joyce was taught the other because he had more of this athletic approach to it, and so they were taught, what suited them best, which we can circle way back around to that later on, because that's exactly what we don't do any longer. It's one size fits all. So when I started teaching, I was teaching vinyasa. We use the sun salutation as like part of the entry in, and then you could focus off on different aspects of practice. And that's when vinyasa started. There wasn't a vinyasa style yoga outside of Ashtanga prior to that. John Friend had reinterpreted the Iyengar stuff, where he felt like there was no heart in it because it was so rudimentary, right? And you did it this way, and you folded your blankets this way. So he brought heart back into that and reframed it as Anusara yoga, so it had this progression, and it still keeps going, and it still keeps evolving.
And so who are the teachers that influenced you the most?
Wow. Well, Tias, I had never been able to study with, and plus I wasn't drawn to a teacher or practice prior to connecting with him. And so I studied with him for probably like 8 years, and certainly 5 years before I started teaching, which is another thing. Like, most people do teacher trainings now, and then they start teaching if they get a slot somewhere. I studied 5 years before I started teaching. And so I studied with Tias. He was my base. And then I would go off and do workshops with John Friend. John Friend was just starting to call what he was doing Anusara. Krishna Das was there on his harmonium, just checking out this song, checking out this kirtan that he was going to sing to everybody pre his first CD. And we'd be sitting there after these hour-long practices, and he'd come in with this harmonium and play. We just all like melt and cry.
Oh my
and it was just so touching. So it was like right at these really pivotal times, where things were just starting to happen. This is like mid to late 90s. And then there was a woman named Annie Pace, who was a senior Ashtanga teacher in Colorado that I studied with a lot. She was totally amazing, like totally committed to the practice, 100%, everything down the line. And Richard Friedman also. I would drive up from Santa Fe to Boulder, the other Santa Fe, and study with Richard. And so those were the real consistent people that I worked with. There have been so many others that I've taken classes from and little workshops from and this and that, but those are the main people. And then when I got to Berkeley, I ended up coming to Berkeley to study with a tantric Ayurvedic teacher who showed me a whole different system. And I had been teaching already for about 10 years when that happened. I had very mystical connections with him prior to meeting him, and that's what brought me out to Berkeley, and that's how you and I got to meet. So that's kind of the scope of it.
I think it's interesting, actually, that men were so few and far between in yoga classes, but yet a lot of these pivotal teachers that came and brought yoga to the West were men.
Absolutely.
A lot of the people that you mentioned.
And because the Ashtanga, because they were challenging practices at that time, more men were doing them. There were male teachers. And, at one point I ended up teaching this workshop for some conferences and stuff called Men in Yoga, because so many men coming into yoga by the 2000s, that period on, like there were so many female teachers teaching that they had no idea that this used to be taught father to son, grandfather to grandson. It was passed down within the male patriarchy forever, and they had no idea because they were just around a room full of women, being the minority and having a female teacher, so that flipped around like really quickly. And whereas women cultivated a community because because it was so male dominated, that women started doing things like moon circles and postnatal, prenatal, started focusing on stuff that the men weren't focusing on, and so they bonded and started their own community. And then I think that's how it grew to be such a female dominated practice, or institution, I guess, at this point. From that, whereas men didn't bond. That's why I did this workshop for years, because it was like, let's just sit in a circle and let's just honor our forefathers who passed this down. And we don't even know about them. We don't even, nobody knows whose teacher is any longer. They'll tell you the training they went through, but there's not a teacher that they've studied with predominantly that can really understand their psyche and understand their physicality and really, make a difference in that person's life.
I think it's interesting that you say that, because when I started practicing yoga, started practicing in 99 and started teaching in 2003. And what drew me to the practice was that sense of community and commitment and loyalty. And what I found was that me and everyone that I knew in the yoga community, we would float around from class to class to class till we found the person that we'd resonate with. And then we would stick with that teacher for years and be committed to them and to that practice and to the schedule, and like really embracing them and everything that they had to offer, until it felt like it was time to move on. Maybe that was 2, 3, 4 years. And that's what I feel like has been one of the biggest shifts in the yoga community, is that it is this like a la carte, where you just pop into this class, and then, this one has a special, and you just go to this class and this class and this class. And there's no consistency with the community, because I would go to those classes, and not only would the teacher be the same, but the student body would be the same, and we would be welcoming to new people. But there was this like sense of going into this class and having this experience with these people. And I feel like that's what's been lost in classes now, is that there's not a sense of community. Within the classes, there's a lot of just switching around from teacher to teacher. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Well, it did become more of like, what's convenient for my schedule, right? And because there's a yoga studio on every block, or there was pre-pandemic, we can just go to what fits into our schedule, which that was never the case when we were starting. It was like, this is when the classes, you showed up. TS used to lock the door if you didn't show up on time. You didn't take class. And we would never do that. Now it's like, oh, I don't want to offend anybody, and come in whenever it's convenient for you. And
but we would never come in late like that.
Exactly.
If we were going to be late, we would drive home, because that would be incredibly rude.
Right, exactly. And you weren't on your phone, like, prior to the class starting and all that stuff, or your watch, or whatever device is currently attached to people.
Well, I also remember, classes were 90 minutes. And so that was definitely an experience. For years and years and years, it was 90 minutes, and that was what it was. And then it moved to 75, and then it moved to, 55. And now classes are
lunchtime yoga.
Yes. And there's no 90-minute classes that I know of that exist, maybe outside of the Ashtanga world. Do you have 90-minute classes?
My Saturday class is still 90 minutes. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. And the same people still come to it that have been coming forever, plus new folks. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's a big difference between a 90-minute and a 55-minute.
And you believe me, I've been there through the process of studios going like, oh, would you mind? Could you cut your class down to like, or do you want to teach this class that's like 55 minutes long? I remember when Ashtanga, the primary series, if you're going through any of those series, even at a good clip, an hour, 15 minutes, an hour and a half, if you're really like just doing the do. And people were teaching it for an hour, and at like 9 o'clock at night in the city, because people could go to a night class. And this is like totally counterintuitive about how your energy moves around when it's supposed to be relaxing into Kappadosha at nighttime,
right.
Resting, and you're bringing up all this pitta and heat and fire, and then you're going to be awake for like the rest of the night. It's just like no sense. So I've seen that also happen when they're going, oh yeah, can you cut your classes down to like, no. I said no a lot.
Mm-hmm.
At a certain point, because I didn't understand.
But I think that's something to be said about our attention spans, where
Mm.
I'd say most people have trouble just kind of focusing on anything for more than 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And I would say a lot of people would really struggle with going to an hour and a half class and actually like cutting their phone off, cutting themselves off from society, going inward, taking that time for themselves. I think that people find that hard now when we're in such a fast-paced society.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that people like also is this uh, routine. It's like Bikram's yoga forever. It's like it's always the same. It's never different. It doesn't matter what season it is, what your age is, anything. This is the sequence, right? And there are a lot of vinyasa teachers that teach. I mean, they'll throw something in, always like a pivotal pose somewhere, but mostly it's the same sequence over and over again, and people are attracted to that. I understand totally. It's something that's attractive, but we just reinforce something. We get attached to the way this is, and yes, we feel better for those hours or minutes or whatever after class, but as we move into this world of AI, I just listen. I just listen sometimes to classes that are taught online, like on YouTube or on TikTok or whatever. And it's like an AI could be teaching this class. It's just a routine. You could program that and they can do it. And you don't need you don't need a teacher there.
Mm-hmm.
My classes, I'm always throwing different things in. Always, 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 always. And not because I'm trying to do that necessarily, as just feels natural to me to add things and I'm changing. The practice is changing for me. This is how I'm presenting it now. This is how I understand it now. And I thank them, because I said a lot of people don't like having to learn something new that's not in this, like, we all know how to do a sun salutation, and that there's something gorgeous in that and wonderful. I'm not putting that down, but I'm just saying that we get into like this habit of yoga is only one way. So then what happens when you have an injury? What happens when you become 50 or 60 or 70? Can you do the same practice that you were doing when you were 20 and 30? And people don't know what to do. It's like, oh, I can't do yoga anymore, because it's like, well, that's because you don't know the range of yoga. You don't know what's, totally possible within that container of yoga, And there's actually studies that show, like, one of the best what antidotes to, hopefully, to Alzheimer's, and which is of course a senior problem, is being able to learn different movement patterns from somebody else, because our nervous system, we all move the way our nervous system understands movement and flow, right? And when we're forced to take on somebody else's choreography, like, your mind has to really, your brain has to really function at a super capacity to do that. So there's actually advantage in not just doing the same movement pattern over and over again.
And I kind of see benefit in both. I think sometimes when there's like a consistent pattern and people know what to expect, then you kind of forget about your body and can move into like deeper breath and deeper aspects. But I've also been on the flip side where I took a class at, I don't even want to say, but anyway, I took a class and
tell me.
it was very, very fast paced, and it was very technical, and it was very flowy, very active, very alpha, very creative, but to the point where I actually saw somebody dislocate their shoulder in the class. And I was thinking, oh my God, for the people that don't know about alignment, this fast pace and this lack of awareness of movement, people are going to get hurt. And the breath was so incredibly fast. It was dangerous. And this is a place that gets a lot of people.
Of course.
And I was kind of blown away by it. I was blown away by the pace, because it was double time. And it was so technical that even me being pretty advanced and having a pretty advanced practice, had to be super mindful of my alignment so that I wouldn't get hurt. And that what was happening with my nervous system was, and I couldn't follow their breath because it was so fast that it would have done the opposite of what I would hope yoga would do, would be to kind of chill out my nervous system and relax it. And when I left, I was stressed out. Not only that, the class was also 108 degrees or something. And so I don't think that's for everybody. For me, I might as well like lay down and just kind of die in the class because like I'm non-functional at that level of heat. But I guess let's kind of dig around and see if we can find some of the positive changes.
Yeah, well, there are positive changes, and I would just add to the sweat phenomenon. It's like I've taken people's classes where it's so hot. Well, first of all, I've always been able to dehydrate really quickly because of my dosha, my constitution. So like I don't need to rush that process because I'm aging like everybody else, But it's like if I'm so wet that I can't do a pose because I can't hold it because I'm slipping out of it because I'm so wet, I can do the pose, but I can't do it when I'm soaking wet. Mm-hmm. So where's the advantage of that? I think the positive things, like when the pandemic hit and I was like at home going like, oh, this is cool. I'll just do my practices and talk to my boyfriend and, do what we do. And then people go like, are you going to start teaching online or something? I don't know, should I? It's like I wasn't planning on it. And then all of a sudden, I'm in people's rooms, I'm in people's homes, they're in my home, and my students who have moved back to Europe or to the East Coast or to Hawaii are taking class with me in my living room. That was crazy good. And we did keep a community together. Same people were showing up, and that was amazing. I never saw that coming in my wildest dreams. I don't think anybody did really, but that's been a really positive thing. And I continue to, on my private sessions, which I do out of the studio, my studio here, I do half of them in person, but most people are still online. It's easier. They're still at home. It's easier to do that. And I know them well enough and it works really well to, so that's been a really positive thing, how the internet kept us together and kept practice going and, and the consistency of community totally has been a beautiful thing. The other thing that I've been seeing in San Francisco in the Bay Area is that so several of the big conglomerate studios, Yoga Tree, Yoga Works, Yoga Crunch, whatever they are, most of those all went under during the pandemic, right? They filed bankruptcy and they closed. So all these studio spaces were just around. What's happened in the city is that more people have gone in as private investors or like sole proprietors, even as a team of people, and reclaim some of those studios. And so the studios that are being successful now are the ones that are owned by, it's like kind of like gone back to grassroots, right? So now that there's these studios that are thriving right now are sole proprietorships, I think it's really a beautiful thing that it's not the big, part of a hedge fund, which is what they were prior to closing down. So I think that's really positive. Yeah. What about you? What do you see that's positive that's happening currently?
I think that access to yoga is really available for everybody. Anybody who wants to do it has the ability to do it from their home, from, anywhere that they want. I think sometimes there's those apps out there, then people start with the apps and then hopefully, they dive in with a teacher. I feel like when COVID hit, the community crumbled here in Colorado and Denver. I don't feel like there was a massive community. Like we talked about how in the older days, there was a big, strong sense of community. But I definitely felt the yoga community collapse, and other things have popped up over here. But I'm not really sure about the quality. It's really tricky now because you can go and pay $135 and become a yoga teacher and teach anywhere. And, when I did my training, we had to live at the ashram for a month. We wake up at, I don't know, 5:30 in the morning, they'd be dinging a bell in the hall and we'd have to get up, and all the way till 9:30 at night, we were doing a meditation and we lived there and we ate. food, and we did all the Kriya practices. And so now I think, anybody can become a teacher, but I also feel like the cream rises to the top, and the ones that are good will probably get the following and get the recognition. But I miss that sense of community. I miss the collaboration with the teachers. I'm not feeling it here in Colorado, but I've also lived in, I don't know, 8 states. And I feel like over the years, that's just kind of slipped from every place that I've lived. And I miss that. But I do like how yoga is accessible to everybody. And, even on YouTube, you can get a plethora of good teachers that offer free yoga. So it's accessible to everybody, where before, yoga classes are really expensive. And not everybody can afford it. And
Yeah.
I think sometimes people think of yoga as like one thing. And I would always say, try a million different teachers and try tons of different styles. And even within one style, try 10 teachers within that style, because one of them might resonate with you. And so there's so many styles, there's so many teachers, that I think it could be really overwhelming for somebody that's brand new to coming into yoga.
Yeah, and who teaches beginning yoga classes anymore? Hardly anybody. You just kind of have to jump in and hope for the best. And that's so easy to get frustrated if it doesn't align with you, because then, and then you think that's it, that's yoga, that didn't work for me, so I'm going to leave. I think that, the other thing about like these teacher trainings where people, can in 3 months get certified, right? And I just talked to somebody recently who's having a challenging time with several studios, and they have made a point of not bringing on senior teachers because they couldn't afford more senior teachers. So, and that's the other side of it. Like, until the pandemic, teachers were never paid what they deserved. It's funny to me how many people don't know a lot of the senior teachers, because there's so many people out there doing things. Not that that's the only way, but there's that thing of having taught when you've taught something as long as you have, you just have a finesse with it. You just have an understanding of it, and it flows through you because it's part of you.
What do you think some of the biggest misconceptions are about yoga these days?
That you can learn it from a TikTok clip. Because, like, I look through, and of course I look through on Instagram and everything else, and it's like people saying, oh, if your back hurts, just do this. Or if you want to be living longer, just do this. And so I really dislike seeing people offer things that it can't deliver from doing this one thing. Do this one pose. It's not going to change your sciatica unless you really are working with somebody who really understands that. And so and also that their target audience are mostly 20 and 30-year-olds. So I understand for that age group, that probably works, and that may change your life. But what happens when you're 40? What happens when you're 50?
Right.
So
I think my frustration is too that there's a lot of people that come to yoga and they think that there's one right way to do something, and there's a million right ways to do something, or that they might not ever be able to get that back bend because of the way that their bones are stacked in their body. That they might just physically never be able to get that, and that's okay. It doesn't even matter. It's not even that important. Or the person that's on Instagram that's doing a back bend when they could touch their ankles and like do Cirque du Soleil stuff. Who knows what their body's going to be like in a couple of years, but they also might have other limitations. They're not showing their limitations. We all have limitations. There's nobody that's going to get everything perfectly. And there's always going to be people that are better at things than us, and that are going to have a harder time. And I think the danger comes into comparing ourselves to others. And so when we go on to some Instagram pages and we see all these beautiful people and these beautiful poses, that's really nothing about what yoga is about. It's not even about the physical practice. It's not even about hitting those poses. And it's so much deeper. And I wish that people would understand a little bit more about the deeper aspects of yoga. And for me, it was always the breath. The breath was always the the key to, for me, and that's what I teach, but the breath is kind of the avenue to bring you into your body and to understand kind of what's going on. And I get a little frustrated with the focus on the physical practice, because that's such a small piece of what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
And so what philosophies do you kind of weave into your classes? I know you bring in Ayurveda and a bunch of other neat
Ayurveda,
things.
Tantra, mindfulness, really, I will do, I've been incorporating more Qigong into a lot of my sequences and stuff in class, and I will do anything or somatic work, anything that brings you into a transformative state of consciousness. And there are certain practices that do that instantly, and it's like, that's it. That's the yoga right there. It doesn't have to look like a triangle pose or a back bend. Whatever's going to get you there, that's the most important thing to me. And there's a moment like at the end of class when everyone's in Shavasana, and I'll just say, okay, so there's a place where you can feel that everyone in the room is kind of like flattened out into like this. And to me, that's the namaste. That is where we are one. It's not contrived. It is simply it's a tangible experience that we can have when practicing around others, where you feel the whole room settles into this moment where the personality isn't promoting and pushing everything. And to me, so whatever I need to do to get to that, that's what I'll do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really kind of the practice that I follow. So it's kind of like calling it out. It is mindfulness practice, but it's also saying like, okay, because you can feel it. It's tangible.
Mm-hmm. You can
So
feel, it's like a pin can drop and you'll hear it.
it's like you're sitting in a long meditation retreat with a lot of people, and you can, the first several days everyone's a little agitated, and there's a moment when the energy in the room just goes.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's when everybody's mind settles to a certain place. And that's, that's the thing that we want to feel more of in our lives and in our breath and everything else, because that's what really matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we are in the roller coaster. We are on this ride right now, and it's just going to continue. And I think the importance of being able to step back from our negative bias, from the stories that our mind is telling us about everything, and step back from that and just step into presence. And so we can allow for whatever is coming up to come up and to be there, not try to change it or whatever, but just keep opening to it, because that's our choice. We either resist or we embrace.
Mm-hmm.
We resist or we embrace, and those are our choices.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like when you're in a yoga pose, right? And you're in a forward fold and you're like, oh, I'm going to touch my feet. And that's that resistance. And then if you can just drop into the breath for a second and just go into that moment of ease, then all of a sudden things kind of open up, even though you're not even trying. Mm-hmm. And as you've evolved as a teacher, what are some things that you used to do that you no longer do? Because I think one of the things I miss actually is I miss and I don't miss is those hands-on adjustments. That was actually, as a student, how I learned the most and how I grew the most. And I have gone from doing huge adjustments to, just moving something with my finger. And we used to get adjustments in Savasana when somebody would just kind of hold our head, and all of that has been pulled completely out of the classes. And I do miss that. And I do feel like those were valuable. I totally understand the reasoning why. But as a student, and I've seen how, as a teacher, how the biggest growth sometimes come from like somebody just kind of moving your hips a little bit, and you're like, oh my God, I didn't realize I was doing that for 3 years in this pose. And then now it's so much easier. And so what are some things that you've taken out of your practice or changed or
Well, all of
evolved?
those were out of my teaching, not so much out of my practice, but out of my teaching for sure. I've always used humor as part of it. So by being lighthearted about it, people will like, oh my God, did he really say that? Just kind of. So I've always been a loose cannon in that way, and I've definitely been called out. And I definitely have my own feelings about can I say cancel culture? Because it is part of. I mean, I live in Berkeley, like we're at the hub of part of that culture, and just where everything is like needs to be limited. For instance, there is a pose called noose pose in yoga. It's a noose pose. Well, the noose is used for cattle because it came out of India, and I can't, it's like, oh, somebody wrote me on that. I said, oh, so, let's do noose pose. And oh, you really shouldn't use that word. It's like, okay, I get that. And this is where it's coming from, So I still take chances. I still take a lot of risk. And I do say, is it okay if I put my hands here? Is it okay if I give you an adjustment? And then people do have cards in class that they can put out, which I love.
Yeah.
And they can either say, yes, touch me, or no, don't touch me. But so kind of adjusting to that, And also people are, because of the state of the world and the state of our minds, people get triggered so easily about everything. So it's a given to me that if you're in front of a group of people, somebody's going to take issue with what you're saying or how you're saying it or how you're acting or how you're dressed or what you look like. There's no way to not be able to trigger people at this point in time, I think, because we're all feeling this trembling that's going on, and we all express it in our own way.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Actually, you have to be, I mean, as a teacher in a public class, you have to be pretty careful about what you do, what you say, how you act. But I think that there's a lot more people also walking around with trauma than ever before. And trauma, not even necessarily, I mean, there's a lot of trauma in the world, but just like daily trauma, getting accosted on the road and getting honked at and getting screamed at. And it's just, I think we're all a little more sensitive and a lot more hyper alert than we used to be.
It's like we've got these two realities going on, right? And I think that's part of it. Like I really feel the climate crisis is like here now. It's not something that's going to happen in 5 years. It's here now. We're seeing it. We're all affected by this. So that's going, like this threat is like coming up. And we know that it's coming up and we feel helpless about what to do about it and all this. And that's what I'm saying. That people are either conscious that they're feeling either grief or just being triggered by the possibility of losing homes and land and food and everything else, that is just part of our consciousness right now. And I feel it's important to talk about that without triggering more trauma for people so that we can be with it and we can know that it's there. And how do we take care of ourselves? Knowing that, how do we take care of our families? How do we take care of things? It gives us a way of seeing and perspective, like what's really important here. Things can look really empty when the dynamics get so big, right? Just be over here and just keep trying to figure it out together and practice.
So when people come to your classes, what do you hope their takeaway is?
I hope that the takeaway is that they've actually had a tangible experience of themselves that's not thought-based, that's not thinking mind, and that thinking mind is like usually just negative bias the whole time. I mean, most of it's the thinking mind is mostly, it's survival. So it's like doing this the whole time trying to save us. So that they have so that you just experience 5 minutes, breath or two, an hour of being in the space where all that's going on is the practice. We're not on our phones, we're not scrolling, we're not on our to-do list, we're just simply here. And that is miraculous. And so I hope that, they feel something.
Well, how do people connect with you if they want to find you, David?
Through the website, moreyoga.com and
MOR.
MOR, because if you go to MORE, it's a prop house. So it's just MOR, which is the first three letters of my last name. And it has, my weekly schedule. It also has some classes by demand that have been pre-recorded from other classes. And the retreats that I'm doing in Mexico and here, are also listed there. So.
Oh, well, it was so fun to connect with you, David. I really appreciate your time. Take care.
Real treat to see you. Big hug to the family, too.
Thank you, David.
Okay, love. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Connected Community Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I can be found at www.nikkiyoga.com, NICKYYYOGA.com. Until I see you again next week, I hope you have a beautiful day.